A very good evening to our viewers in India, and good morning to our viewers in the United States of America. Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and other parts of the world. It is about 8 p.m. in India, and as the United States of America wakes up, it's almost certain, unless there's another twist in the tail, that Joe Biden is 99.9% likely to be the next president of the United States of America. The election has not been officially called, but Biden is certainly inching closer to the White House, and Trump's chance of re-election is swiftly slipping away. Like we said, this is not an election result yet, but it seems the most likely outcome. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to ask an India-specific question. What does all of this mean for our part of the world? Remember, the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, had invested a great deal of his personal energy in building a relationship with Donald Trump. Trump was even here in India in February, and then, of course, there was the Howdy Modi extravaganza event. What would a Biden-led government, in fact, mean for Indian interests? And there are also others who have drawn parallels between the rise of Modi and the rise of Trump. Is that a valid parallel? Well, we've got a very interesting panel coming up, and let me introduce them right away. I have on the program today Manoj Ladwa. Manoj is, of course, a good friend, but apart from that, he is also the head of the India Inc. group based out of London, and he has advised the BJP on multiple of its election campaigns, so really a right-wing ideologue and close to the ruling party in India. We're also joined by Ambassador Singh, a man not known to pull his punches, one of our best-known and best-regarded diplomats. And in a moment from now, I'm actually waiting for Wall Street Journal columnist Sadanand Dhume. I'm sure he'll be dialing in any moment now. But I think the question that we're really asking is what a Biden presidency might mean for India. And I think that is the question before us. And I'm going to put that question straight away to Manoj. And I say that, Manoj, because you were among those who was leading the organization around that Howdy Modi event. There's a sense here that might have been a mistake, that we may have, in fact, invested too much of our capital in building a relationship with one man, especially when we knew that an election was coming up. So before I, talk about what a Republican government means for India and what a government led by the Democrats means for India, let me just ask you to respond to that one criticism and also how you look at the election that's unfolding in the United States of America thus far.
Thanks a lot, Barkha. The biggest criticism
now we can hear you.
Yeah. The biggest criticism that India faced over many, many years or decades was its underinvestment in relationships in the West with the UK and more so with the USA. What Modi has been able to do with successive presidents, it was Obama, he invested a fair amount of time and political capital with President Obama, and then with President Trump, is that he's brought some balance into those relationships. So I don't think you could ever accuse India of over-investing. I think the accusation over decades has been that it's underinvested in the US relationship, and this has been rectified over the last few years.
When you say over-investing and under-investing, Manoj, you're really talking about a relationship with a country. But I think the criticism that has come up is the relationship with a person. And I'm sure Casey will speak more to that. But respond to that, when we look at the fact that there was this event that took place, the Howdy Modi event, there was a sense that the Prime Minister and India was taking a side, and it was choosing to back one person over the other. This was not the most tactful thing to do, given that elections were just a few months away. How would you respond to that criticism?
Look, he's the president of the United States. So whoever would have been the president of the United States, if they chose to come to a Modi rally, and Prime Minister Modi is well known for hosting, being a guest at huge rallies around the world for the diaspora, the same would have been accorded there. I don't see any difference to that. And one thing that's missed from these pictures is the massive roll call of Democrats that attended that event as well, that were on stage just before President Trump came onto the stage with Prime Minister Modi. And Prime Minister Modi was on the stage with some very, very senior Democrats as well. So I don't think that he can be accused of being partisan. President Trump was the president of the United States. He still is. the president until the results are declared and the inauguration happens. So I don't think it's a fair criticism at all.
Okay, let me take that right away to Ambassador K.C. Singh. I think what you're hearing Manoj saying is that India will do business guided by self-interest with whoever is the president. After all, Narendra Modi had a pretty decent relationship with Barack Obama as well. I remember Obama writing up the Time magazine profile, for example, on the Prime Minister. So do you think that this criticism is in fact a valid, K.C.? You've expressed some concerns about India taking a side. I think Manoj is saying that no such side was in fact taken.
Look, investing in US, investing in foreign leaders, building up a relationship with them is, of course, what the Indian Prime Minister must do. But there is a dividing line where you start playing that relationship into their domestic politics, or they start playing it into your domestic politics, or you start using the diaspora functions to attack India, indirectly send signals about opposition, about really using the diaspora stage as a global stage from where you are really relaying things back, because everything is seamless today. It's not a closed function. Everything gets beamed across. Now, to say that, Prime Minister did raise the slogan, Ab ki bar, and then he let the crowd fill in the rest. Now, no, we are not kids here. And very clearly, if you raise a politically surcharged slogan like that in Houston, with Trump beaming and holding your hand and raising, this is not normal reaching out. This is not normal cultivation of a relationship with a foreign leader. This is playing into the domestic politics. Now, whether Democrats internalize it, it plays out now when Biden comes in. Don't forget, Texas is being very closely fought. So, if the separation is by a few thousand votes, and in their perception, the Indian tilt 10% extra vote or 15% extra vote, somebody in the Democratic Party may internalize that. Their bureaucracy may, or somebody may. Now, to give you an example, Abe had a great relationship. He was one of the first to engage Bush, but that relationship was built on playing golf with him. It was, he went down to Florida. You can try flattering a foreign leader, but to do it through personal engagement, shared interests, engaging him or his family in a manner where you develop a friendship with them. But you do these rallies, you go to a rally. Now, this is really, if you want to say that this is just par for the course, I'm afraid I disagree.
Okay, let me give Manoj a chance to respond. Sadanand Dhume is with us, and we'll bring him into the conversation in a moment. Sadanand, the only thing you kind of missed was Manoj making the argument that India invested in a country, and in fact that there was not enough investment in the relationship, and all the Modi government did was to ratchet up that investment. K.C. Singh making the point that Howdy Modi extravaganza, and Manoj was among his many hats that he wears, he was also organizing that was a clear political affiliation, and it won't go down well with the Democrats. So Manoj, let me give you a chance to respond to that Ab ki bar slogan that Mr. Modi raised from the stage, and that Ab ki bar Trump Sarkar kind of completing itself, and how the Democrats might be viewing that.
Look, there's a few things here. Firstly, let's not treat the diaspora as muppets. They will make their own decision as to who they wish to vote for here. I'm in the UK, and there are members of the diaspora that vote for the Labour Party. There are those that vote for the Conservative Party. That's the same that happens in the US as well. And we need to move beyond just these, these rallies and so on. They're important. They have a place to play. And Modi has a certain charisma and a charm when he packs stadiums. But you've got to look at what has actually happened over the last 6 years. And I decidedly used the time frame of the last 6 years, because it was under Obama that the relationship was really elevated to a strategic relationship and that big defense cooperation relationship. Then you had the 2x2 agreement that the 2x2 meetings would take place. And so you're seeing that whether it's in defense, whether it's in strategic affairs, whether it's in commerce and business, or indeed in culture and education, you've seen a dramatic change over the last 6 years in India's engagement with the US, and indeed the US's engagement with the US. So you cannot just sort of deride all of that by one event, one rally, and so on. Yes, this is the persona of Prime Minister Modi. He does pack stadiums, and world leaders want to be part of that action. Trump happened to be president at that time. David Cameron was Prime Minister of the UK when we packed out Wembley Stadium. Harper in Canada and other leaders around the world. This is his enigma. But the politics, the diplomacy and the politics happens, and you can see the results for yourself.
Okay, Sadanand, let's bring you in at this point. At one level, I do actually see Manoj's point that people are, the diaspora is not a bunch of Muppets. But I think Casey's point is it's not about the diaspora, it's about the Democrats, and that from a Biden point of view, Mr. Modi made a preference. Do you think that Howdy Modi extravaganza went down like that? The other thing that one has to be clear about is that, there is in the right-wing Indian base a skepticism about the Democrats. There is, for example, no hurrahs going up for Kamala Harris, despite the fact that she's biracial, maybe because of earlier comments that she's made on Kashmir and so on. So do you think Mr. Modi has handled the Trump relationship in the manner that he should have, or did he invest too much too soon in Donald Trump? Sadanand.
Yes, actually, I was in some kind of waiting room and I wasn't able to get in, so I did follow the Manoj's and Ambassador Singh's comments. Manoj's point is well taken to the extent that if you were looking at the overall stewardship of the US-India relationship, in fairness, you have to say that the Modi government has achieved a lot. And in fairness to the Trump administration, so have they in terms of defense cooperation and so on. On the narrow question of the Houston rally and then followed by the Ahmedabad rally, I do think they crossed a line. And the way I looked at it, it was a gamble. Now, if the gamble had paid off, and if Trump had come back, then you could argue that this quasi-endorsement of Trump, which is very unusual, would have been a good gamble. They would have said, okay, look, he rolled the dice, his guy came back, Trump really values personal loyalty above everything else, values this idea of what can you do for me personally above everything else. Modi did not move the needle dramatically, but it's very clear that the Indian electorate is more divided than it was in the past. It's very clear that elements of the diaspora that have been close to the BJP have been working for the Trump administration, towards the Trump administration's re-election, or Mr. Trump's re-election. And so the gamble was made. You can argue that it was a gamble that has not paid off. So now that the gamble looks like it is not paying off, I think it is fair to criticize it, because there are political repercussions, just as Ambassador Singh has pointed out. The Democrats did notice. People are not children. And the problem is not the rally per se, but the problem is using an election slogan that Trump had used. Now, if it turns out, this election is still a cliffhanger. If it turns out that Trump finds some miraculous path back to the White House, then I will turn around and say that, Modi gamble paid off.
That's convenient. That's not fair.
It's a gamble.
That is not
gambling fair. On the
a gamble by definition is a gamble.
No, a gamble that pays off. If I go into a casino and I gamble and I walk out with $1 million, I'm a winner. If I go into a casino and I gamble and I come out with zero, I'm a loser. And that's how to assess it.
Okay, here's what I want Casey to come in on, and then Manoj can respond to both of those points. As a diplomat, should that gamble have been played at all? Was there a need for the gamble? I think that would be the question that should be asked, that what would have changed if you hadn't played that gamble?
Look, as I said earlier, leaders at that level, if they have a socio-cultural affinity, there are other ways to engage leaders. You go to an opera, you discuss things. But you see, Trump is only interested in women and golf. Now, how does Mr. Modi discuss either one of those things with him? Or, you can make snide remarks for other people. He's a base man. So to that extent, how do you engage a man like that? Now, for instance, John F. Kennedy, he tried his best to engage Nehru, but they could not. Because Nehru was very much an English gentleman, and Kennedy just could not. They were two very effete, very polished people, but they couldn't connect. Kennedy, even to the extent he went to the Westchester, he went to the port itself to receive the Prime Minister and took him in a boat, on his personal boat, took him for a ride. But they still couldn't connect. So, sometimes chemistry just doesn't work. But the question is, in diplomacy, you do not bring in. Let me give you an example. Let me ask Manoj a question. How would India react if a Prime Minister of Nepal came during a national election and started campaigning, asking the Gurkhas here to vote in, if Abki Bar, whoever is supporting the Gurkhas in Gurkha land or West Bengal, how would we react to it? Or if the Bangladesh Prime Minister came in and started sending vague signals in West Bengal to people who have migrated from Bangladesh, there'll be a hue and cry. We want to skin that leader alive. So, there are lines you don't cross. And there are other ways to do it. So I think the fact that Mr. Modi chooses public spectacle to engage other people is both a sign of, a social, basically a social disparity in terms of your background or how you engage the other person. And therefore you choose spectacle. Whereas leaders don't do that. Leaders, let me give you one example. Yeah. Just one thing, just very quickly, just one thing as foreign minister. He came to UAE just as right there as an ambassador. Now, the Minister of State that time was Sheikh Zayed's son. He was the Minister of State, and there was a foreign minister who was a commoner. Now, what they did was they fixed a lunch with the Minister of State. Now, the Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs was hopping mad, saying, how can an External Affairs Minister have lunch with a Minister of State? And there's a foreign minister. When he landed there, I told him that. And in the car, he tells me, he says, there's a Western protocol, there's an Indian protocol, and there's an Arab protocol. Arey bhai, if the ruler's son has invited me for lunch, why wouldn't I go? You see, now this is a way of engaging them. He could, as someone from Jodhpur, someone who had dealt with royalty, he immediately connected. The Indian bureaucracy could not understand it.
Yeah.
So now he went to Saudi Arabia. He told Prince Abdullah, who was then the crown prince, and he opened actually the doors to Saudi Arabia haven't been opened by Modi government. They were opened by just one Singh. Because he told him, Your Highness, I am also from the desert. And then Abdullah took him to his stud farm and gifted him 2 horses. Because they could connect at a certain level as riders, lovers of horses, as from the desert. So you seek a connectivity in diplomacy. Or you do spectacle.
Okay, let Manoj respond now. I think you made your point quite passionately, and Manoj, you're quite amused. But both Sadanand and Casey on a spectrum have the same point of view. Sadanand says if the gamble pays off, hey, well done, no problem. I'm not approaching this through the prism of conservative diplomacy. Ambassador Casey Singh seems to be making a more complex point. He's saying interpersonal connections are part of building relationships between nations. But there was nothing else for Trump and Modi to do. That would have brought them together except fill a stadium. And then it was a gamble. And today you've got to look at the gamble and say, maybe that gamble went wrong.
Look, firstly, I totally agree with Sadanand on the point that, look, these things are gambles. And Modi, above anybody else, is a huge gambler. And that's part of his success. So I don't think we should criticize him for that. It's a fact of life, and it's a fact that he does. But the point that was humoring me to large extent is, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for KCG, and I've heard him numerous times on subjects, is the whole thing about opera, horse studs, golfing, and so on. This is a very Latvian's old world view of diplomacy, my friend. The world has changed significantly. You cannot look. The world has changed, and diplomacy now is done in a much more rapid, a much more populist sort of way. And Prime Minister Modi is a master of that, and he's proven that to be the case. And I go back to the substance, and the substance is in the last 6 years, and I think Sadanand, I'm sure we'll have comments on this, is that there have been substantive improvements in the relationship between the US and India. The breadth of the relationship has expanded exponentially. The depth of the relationship has expanded exponentially. And on the point of whether the Democrats are annoyed or not annoyed, you just have to look at the most recent article or blog of Joe Biden on India and looking forward to working with India and Prime Minister Modi. Look, they are much more mature than that. One rally and one slogan is not going to change the breadth and depth of the relationship that Prime Minister Modi has established with both President Obama and President Trump. And let's see, if it is President Biden, I'm sure it will continue, but certainly it's not opera and golf that is going to change the dial. It's business and it's defense and it's security and the real issues that is going to change the dial. And that's where I think India has scored extremely well vis-a-vis the US over the last 6 years.
So I think those are all actually pretty interesting points. And I'll take that straight away to Sadanand. One, that old world classic liberal elite view of how diplomacy is conducted. That's how Manoj is slotting sort of Casey's take on that relationship. Two, Sadanand, I think there is a reasonable argument in Manoj saying that it's not like a Biden-led administration is going to sit in a sulk about the fact that there was this Howdy Modi extravaganza. So when you classify it as a gamble, how wrong could this gamble go? I think that's the question. Like, what was really at stake? And I think Manoj also makes the perceptive point that we know that Modi is a disruptor. We know Modi likes to politically gamble. We know Modi likes to push the envelope.
So 2 quick points. I mean, the first one is I didn't interpret Ambassador Singh's point the same way. I think the point he is making is that you tailor personal outreach to your audience. And if their audience happens to be a royal, then you use that. I don't think he's saying that for everybody you use opera and golf. I mean, I don't think that's his point. Though, in fact, in Trump's case, golf might actually work. So I think the point is, how do you tailor this? And then when you have this situation where there is no obvious confluence of interests or backgrounds, can you use something else? And I don't grudge Modi using the Indian diasporas. Like, I don't think too many people criticize the Wembley event, for example, with David Cameron, except for that cloying, awful faux non-interview full of softball questions. But that aside, that may be my personal beef. I don't think people gave Modi too much grief for that, for going to Wembley Stadium with Cameron.
So why was this different? Why was this different?
He crossed the line with the slogan. He crossed the line by appearing to dabble in American domestic politics. On the second point, I think Manoj's point is well taken. If you look at the larger canvas of the US-India relationship, there are responsible adults on both sides. This is something that I would call an irritation and not any kind of deal breaker. So on that, I think I would agree with him.
Okay. Ambassador K.C. Singh, do you want to respond that you've got this old world elite little view of how diplomacy is conducted, that the world has moved on, that what Modi and Trump in fact had in common, although I don't know how Trump had that claim, was to challenge the elites. I mean, Trump is a wealthy New Yorker businessman. So how he came to occupy the anti-elite working class position, I do not know. But that is the...
He eats McDonald's because he eats McDonald's burgers and ketchup with his steak. I mean, come on.
Okay, so if McDonald's is now the definition of being plebeian, then Trump's got himself that. But there's a serious question here. I think Manoj is saying that your view of the world is guided by an old elite IFS Lutyens way of thinking. Would you like to respond to that?
Into it, I think Sadanand has made my point. I think Manojji didn't understand what I was saying, but Sadanand has made that point. But let me come to the bilateral relationship. You see, there is this impression which every prime minister may wish to give, that he's the starting point of a foreign policy. He's the starting point of a reach out. This reach out to America began in 91. It began with Narasimha Rao. Now, foreign policy was retweaked at that point. Now, every prime minister who's come after that, of course, the disruptive element was the nuclear test. That is where the disruption came. And then, of course, the Vajpayee government rebuilt it. Manmohan Singh carried it forward. The defense relationship we are seeing today is not something which began in 2016 or 2014. It's a relationship coming from before, as the nuclear deal was, as the other elements were. So dealing with US has been really a progressive wave where you move forward. Now, of course, if under Mr. Modi, we've decided to literally move strategically much closer than even Mr. Vajpayee was willing to do, then that is the quantum jump. Probably because it's a different China, it's a different world. There's the rise of another hegemon. So India is reacting to that. So what is happening is you are taking the Indo-US relationship and you are now elevating it. All the themes were there, but there was a reluctance domestically. No prime minister could market this kind of proximity where their Secretary of State stood with you and literally challenged China. Don't forget that India always gave access to the Americans to spy on the Chinese in Tibet. We were maintaining that force that we have, which we have used now to capture the heights, that was created during that time. So, foreign policy is both continuum. It's something which was in the past. And then your external environment, and of course, the Prime Minister's personality shapes how you want to go.
So here's my...
his mandate also shapes it.
Right.
Because Vajpayee had a coalition government. So he doesn't have the burden of a coalition government. And he's decided to move India much closer to US strategically. Now, the danger is that we don't know what happens when Biden comes in. Because Biden will look at each one of these relationships, particularly starting with China. It doesn't mean he changes the relationship with India. But the momentum of the relationship, will it continue to be the same? Because he'll re-engage China. He'll not want, because he's the one who never wanted to send troops to Afghanistan. He's not for a very aggressive outward posture. Therefore, when he starts rebalancing, we'll also have to rebalance.
So let me come in on that, sir. Got it. Let me come in on that because, we've spoken about the irritation that the Democrats may feel, but what about the irritation that the Indians may feel with the Democrats? I think the reverse question has to be asked as well. And this is something that Kamala Harris actually said about Kashmir, not after she was announced as the VP nominee, but well before. And it ties in with Jaishankar and the face-off that takes place with Pramila Jayapal, and let me just play this out for you. Kamala Harris earlier in the on Kashmir.
As to the first piece, it is about reminding people that they are not alone and that we are all watching. Because so often when we see human rights abuses, whether they be in this country or around the world, the abuser will convince those that they abuse that nobody cares, and that nobody's watching, and that nobody's paying attention, which is a tool of an abuser. And so that is part of what I would say. We are watching.
We are watching. Sadanand, do you want to take that? Obviously, she was not saying that. Like I said, after she became the VP nominee, she might be much more moderated if she does become vice president, looking increasingly likely. So I think the reverse question has to be asked. What does the Biden presidency mean for India? Can be argued from both sides, right?
Look, Barkha, this particular clip, I think, is a classic example of a tempest in a teacup. This has been portrayed in India as though she was making some kind of deliberate, considered statement on US policy towards Kashmir. What this was some kind of campaign event where someone just randomly asked her the question. She was not prepared. And if you actually go back and listen to her, what she is putting out is random political blabber. If they'd asked her a question about human rights abuses in El Salvador, she would have said the same thing. If they'd asked her about human rights abuses in Indonesian Papua, she would have said, "Yeah, we."
You're not making her sound very deep. You're not making. That's a very patronizing assessment of her own mind and her own articulation.
This is what politicians do when they're on the campaign trail. That is what she did. The Indian nutjob Twitter sphere has blown this up and interpreted this as some kind of great signal of her sort of views on Kashmir. It is not true. Go back and watch the clip. She's asked a question. Even the camera work is shaky. That said, there is going to be a difference between the Biden approach and the Trump approach. And quite simply, it is that the Trump administration was an aberration in US history because they did not care at all about issues of democracy and human rights, at all. Now, they have always been part of the mix. Barkha, you remember when Obama came in 2015, he gave that very well-worded speech, in my view, at Siri Fort, where he talked about...
But then he took the flight. Then he took the flight from that speech, which I agreed with, to Saudi Arabia. And
sure. You can always criticize all of that. But all I'm saying is that as a component of US foreign policy, Democracy was part of it. And what the Democrats tried to do was to say to India, look, live up to the best of your own pluralist ideals. That's the way they tried to frame it. I imagine that is the way the Biden people will try to frame it too. And that will create tensions. And frankly, they will create tensions in part because the BJP and the Modi administration has, particularly since 2017, taken what I would call a hard right and quite an ugly turn on these cultural issues. So that is where the frictions will come up. This is not to say the relationship will be derailed. There are a lot of other equities. I take Manoj's point about defense and business and a whole lot of other stuff going on. But the rub will really lie in a different approach from the Trump administration on issues of human rights. And
so if you had to sort of make a comment about how the Modi, one second, Manoj, Sadanand, just briefly, if you had to make a comment on how the Modi government would then have to readjust to the United States of America if we are looking at a Biden presidency, which seems increasingly likely, all but the calling of it, what would that adjustment have to be, Sadanand? Quickly, and then Manoj can have the last word.
So look, I think the Modi government strategy has been quite clear, which is that to play the China card. So what they're going to say is that, look, let's pretend this is the Cold War again. We have a new Cold War emerging. China is the biggest threat. And to put it very crudely and simply, it's like, let us do whatever we like. We're with you on China. Now, to the degree to which that washes with a Democratic House, we've already seen for the first time, there's been such strong bilateral support in the US Congress for India. For the first time, we have begun to see like a few tears in that because of what happened with Kashmir, CAA, and so on. So that's something that's going to have to be managed. And my hope is that the BJP government will manage it not with its sort of, usual resort to some kind of PR stuntery, but with some kind of serious introspection about the direction in which India is headed.
Okay, let's bring in Manoj now. I think both of you have made reasonable points. Take that, Manoj.
Yeah. No, I agree with Sadanand to the extent that, yes, there are going to be a number of issues that India and in particular Prime Minister Modi and the BJP will have to relook at and calibrate in terms of its relationship with the US. But there's one thing that occurs to me is that, look, there are things that are said when you're in opposition. There's things that you said during election rallies, and of course, and you've made the point, Barkha, as well, that power is a very sobering responsibility. Now, the other thing that's a sobering responsibility is the margin of victory in an election campaign. And a few months ago, every pundit was saying, look, this is going to be a slam dunk for Biden and the Democrats. It's far from it. The US is it's what this election has revealed is the US is extremely divided. It's fractured in many ways. And there are lots of different opinions that Biden, who I think is a liberal conservative, in his will have to take into consideration, because he will have to carry the country with him. And this election is not a blank check for the Democrats to just come in and sort of wipe away a lot of what's gone on. There will be continuum, and as what Ambassador has rightly said, that diplomacy is a continuum, and I agree with that. And you will see. We'll wait and see what happens over the next few weeks and months on this.
Okay. Last comments. I'll start with KC, then Sadanand, then Manoj can wrap it up for us. Keep them brief because we've already actually exceeded our time. We are looking almost 99.9% at a Biden presidency. Ambassador KC Singh, what would you, if you were meeting the foreign minister today, be asking him to look out for? What is that gear shift that's going to be needed almost immediately?
Well, the External Affairs Minister has to be worried about the spat he had with Jayaprakash, with the Congresswoman, which Kamala Harris supported. And then again, when Kamala Harris got the nomination, India was completely quiet. Nobody called him, no message went. And when the foreign ministry spokesman was asked, they said, no, we don't interfere, but she's part of the diaspora. So we are reaching out the diaspora. Here's a diaspora member reaching as high as it can be president of that country one day. Be that as it may, I think essentially every time there's a change from one party to the other, the basic relationship, the momentum will continue. As I said, it's a question of emphasis and speed and their new priorities in which India may. For instance, I supported the 2+2 meeting, although it shouldn't have come that close to the US election, because I think there India was already preparing perhaps that if there is a Biden presidency, he would only take over in January. No Secretary of State would be able to come to India in the next till February, March. But we are facing the Chinese now. So that agreement was required for us now because it's the multiplier as far as the use of various US weapons is concerned. So that really was, I think, a sensible step. Though they took the risk of, normally you do not invite Secretary of State at that level just a week before the election. But these are exceptional circumstances. And I agree with Sadanand, China remains a major common factor. How you deal with it may be different, not necessarily forceful confrontation by a Quad. It may be more containment, more of how to, nor will the decoupling with China be that urgent or that quick or the tariffs that high. I think at least for a time, he will try on three different fronts. One is healing the fractures in the Islamic world, reaching out to China to see if there is a more peaceful way of containing China. And third will be reaching out to Europe and rebuilding his alliances. And fourth will be maybe looking at TPP again, and which is really good for us because we haven't gone to RCEP, which the Chinese are pushing. It's good if a US president engages in Asia-Pacific based, not just a military naval presence, but a trade arrangement.
Let me now bring in Sadanand. That was a very comprehensive response from foreign policy. But I do actually. Go ahead.
I'll keep my comments brief. I mean, I'm not going to get into we could have a whole different discussion on Biden policies on trade and immigration and so on. I just want to leave with one thought. And I think that there is if I were reading the foreign minister, I would say that there's a tendency in Indian foreign policy these days to take a hyper-realist view. And in a way, that's a good thing, right? It's a corrective to the overly idealistic view that prevailed earlier at the sort of this to try to do the opposite of what the Nehruvians did. My worry is that this hyper-realist view does not take into account the way the US sees the world. Now, so, for example, I've been speaking with many senior figures in democratic circles. I mean, in my sort of capacity as a Wall Street Journal columnist, who don't want to be quoted. But if you talk to people and ask them about how they feel about this government in India, the mood is completely different from what it was 3 or 4 years ago. And a lot of this has to do with genuine and deep concerns about an erosion in the quality of Indian democracy. Now, does that mean Biden or Harris are going to go on stage and say that? No. But that also should not mean that people don't internalize the fact that these concerns are real. And what you've seen expressed by the likes of Pramila Jayapal are not some outlier sentiment that you can get rid of by beating them on the head, but it's something that will have to be engaged with seriously and in good faith.
Okay, let Manoj take the last word, then we've got to close. I think there's a kind of bristling, Manoj. In particular, if you look at the Modi way of the world, it could be to do with how the Prime Minister believes the world responded to him when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. Maybe that has not completely lifted. I think we need to understand the psychology of where this government comes from and how it politically thinks. But I think Sadanand's point is an interesting one, that this government does not respond in the same way to a comment on Indian democracy from the United States of America that a previous government may have responded to. So what do you see happening?
Look, there's a number of points that have been raised. Just on my biggest concern is that, not only has a lot changed in India over the last 6 years, a lot has changed in the last 6 months in terms of the world and the way in which countries are having to grapple with COVID and the aftermath of that. My concern is that the US and Biden will be bogged down on domestic matters. There's obviously the issue of racial divide in the US, which is a concern. It's a concern for India as well, because we have a lot of people of Indian origin living in the US as well. So that's equally of a concern for India as well. So let's not just think that the shoe is only on one foot. There are issues that are there. I think that what I would like to see is a leveling of the relationship again. There has been some aberrations over the last few months and years, and to get back onto a strong strategic footing, to focus on economic cooperation, to focus on defense cooperation, to focus on strategic cooperation. And I see no reason whatsoever why that wouldn't happen. And finally, perhaps a flippant point, but if a call had been made to Kamala Harris to congratulate her on her nomination, would that have been regarded by others as an interference within domestic U.S. politics as well?
That's fair. That's fair.
Kamala Sarkar.
I think
one more slogan.
Kamla or Kamal. It's kind of
Kamla and Kamal.
Kamla and Kamal. Should have grabbed that synergy. Sadanand, just before we go, not on a flippant point, but on a serious point, like when are you all calling this election? When can we say that Biden is the next president?
I think very soon. I think probably within the next 2 or 3 hours, we should finally be there.
Okay, thank you. Fascinating conversation, Manoj, Sadanand, Ambassador KK Singh. A pleasure. This is going to be very interesting going forward. And thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.